And from an Islamic perspective, it's not that we are going to ask for equality between the races. We'll say that that definition, that artificial definition of race, is wrong. But then there is a level of ethnicity that is organic, and it's part of every human civilization. It's mentioned in the Quran. And that is real. And that should not be the basis of any difference. But when it comes to a social identity, society does have a place in deciding, on the basis of the value system of that society, what artificially created social identities it wants to acknowledge and which ones it does not. There's one other question I think that we had.
Just one more from the audience, and then I believe that has something. We'll take the discussion a little bit more towards our institution.
Sure.
Yes.
Just based on what you're saying, I think there's something to be said for the fact that I think love or whatever, what have you, is something more profound than or something more maybe important than a tendency to go and gamble, right? It's something that constitutes a major part of human emotion and a major part of somebody's life. So that, like you say, that okay, you know, if you want to compare, so okay, it's like a choice, and you know, it's like somebody who has a propensity to gamble. That's fine, but I think that when you say that, you know, that's the way Allah planned it out or what have you.
That's a fair point. Love is certainly more fundamental to our being than the propensity to gamble. But if that fact means that it's a natural result to have a homosexual identity, then why is this identity a contingent feature of modern Western civilization? Why is it not an organic product of most of the civilizations, either in history or even in the world today?
I don't think that's where I was going with my question. I was gonna say that, like, you say that, you know, Allah's created us like this, and you know, we all have these tests, but I mean, is it considered a more severe test because
it might be. So there might be, there might be some people who have a very strong tendency to commit a particular sin. And certainly God will not judge them as harshly as somebody who does not have that tendency. There's actually a hadith, and I know we want to move on, so I'll just mention one hadith that might not do justice to the topic as a whole, but just so that we can move on. That not praying will be punished more severely by God than committing adultery, than committing fornication. And the reason for that is that fornication is something that happens when a person's passions overcome them. It might not be that a person doesn't believe in God or doesn't care about God. It might be that a person does, but they were just overcome, and they will repent afterwards. But a person not praying is saying that, yeah, I know this is an obligation. There's nothing overcoming me, I just don't care enough. I don't give enough importance to my relationship to God to actually do it. Now that doesn't mean that therefore we can take adultery lightly. It's making that point, that based on what a person's temptations might be, what a person's soul might push them towards, Allah will judge you more or less harshly. The point is valid, that love is a fundamental part of who we are. Islam has not restricted love at all. Right? Love between men, love between women, right? That is not something Islam has restricted in any way. It's a very fundamental part of our humanity. What Islam has restricted is certain actions, certain behaviors. Those behaviors are not who we are. They are what we do. So we don't have to continue the conversation. If you had other questions that might be even, slightly on a different tack, that's fine. I think we have a total of about 15 to 20 minutes that we can continue the conversation.
This is sort of related to the focus and emphasis on individuality in this part of the world. And I guess one of the concerns that Muslim women often have is these insecurities that they might face by growing up in a Western society where from school and stories and films, they're given sort of messages like follow your dreams and anything is possible, and sort of all these types of empowering quote-unquote sort of messages. And where they might sort of look at that and compare it to what some might see in their Muslim communities, perhaps feeling unengaged or perhaps feeling unacknowledged, passive participants. How do we ensure that the future generations of our sisters, how do we help them ensure that they won't have these insecurities growing up in such a society?
It's a very challenging question. And I think the solution to that question has to come not just from the religious answer, but from some level of social sophistication, some perhaps trial and error. But in general, there are a lot of roles that are very valuable in Islam that don't really have much of a definition within modern society. And on some level, we don't want to just tell our sons or our daughters that, well, just succeed on Western terms or on secular terms. We do want to push back somewhat and say that, well, there is another way of looking at the world. One example is old age. Right? People who are old in this society generally try to look and present themselves as young, because old age is not valued. Similarly, tasks that traditionally were very fulfilling for many women, not all, within the family, you know, a woman might very likely among friends be seen as a bit of a failure if her day revolves around children or family or church or masjid or, you know, those types of activities. Now, one level is for us to push back against those aspects of the judgment that come from a materialist worldview, that come from an individualistic worldview that doesn't recognize the complementariness of relationships. Another part of the answer, though, comes from not just pushing back defensively against secular culture, but also trying to take the principles that we have within Islam and applying them in a meaningful and an organic way in today's society. And I'll just give one example that has been discussed by fuqaha, by scholars. You know, there are many other examples that perhaps will be a little bit more controversial, and that's fine. But this is one that has been discussed by fuqaha. Right? On the one hand, we have a belief that it is recommended for a Muslim to pray in the masjid. On the other hand, Sunni and Shia both have a hadith that say that it is best for a woman to pray at home. Right? So now what do we do? Does this mean that we have to deny any of these teachings? Does it mean that we should say, well, the one that says it's best to pray in the masjid is for men, and for women it's best to pray at home? We do know that in the time of the Prophet, women and men both used to pray in the masjid. The Jama'at included both. We do know that it was a matter of some difficulty sometimes to be able to accommodate both men and women respectively. What most of our Shia fuqaha say is that in reality these two ahadith are both right. In other words, both of them apply to women. To pray in the masjid is recommended. The best place to pray is at home is also a valid hadith. But they're speaking about two different values that do exist within Islam. One is that the masjid is a place for worship and spiritual growth for men and women. So that general hadith that it's recommended to pray in the masjid applies to women as well. And the hadith that says that it's best for women to pray at home is because Islam places a value on chastity and on modesty. And in many cases, praying in the masjid will give a woman the chance for participation in a spiritual worship, but it might require her to enter into an environment that would compromise her dignity or her modesty. And the benefit may be more than made up for by a certain harm. And so fuqaha have often said, in combining the two, is to say that it is recommended for a woman to pray in the masjid just like it is for a man. But if there is a circumstance where praying in the masjid is not as able to maintain the dignity and the honor and the chastity of a woman, then it is better for her to pray at home and she will get more reward. In our society, we might also add another consideration that's becoming increasingly relevant, which is that if men and women don't participate in the masjid regularly, their Islamic identity as a whole and their Islamic knowledge may be compromised. And so we could perhaps add to that if a woman is better able to maintain her Islamic identity by active participation in the masjid, then that is better, even if there are other social realities that might not be ideal. And so there's a way for us to try to not just push back against a secular culture and say that, well, we have it all figured out in Islam, but for us to also try to say, what are the underlying principles and values that Islam wants us to give importance to, and then how can we do so in our modern time? Chastity and modesty are important for men and women, but especially for women. And we do want to try as Muslims to see how can we allow women to play a fulfilling and a meaningful role within society, but without the Western conclusion that then we just have to get rid of chastity. It's no longer an operative value in our culture. That's what Western society has done, and we don't want it.
So, if I could respectfully push back just a little bit, just so I understand. So it sounds like to me that the framing you've offered presents the fact that women belong and should be allowed and they should feel comfortable in a masjid, but that there are secondary matters that might make it more thoughtful or spiritual or a better decision for her not to come in certain environments, perhaps if her modesty is going to be compromised in that place. But I guess perhaps due to a lack of imagination or what I've seen in America, generally speaking, the masjid is a relatively wholesome place. Yet we tend to see that, I don't think it's unfair to say that the masjid tends not to be oriented around both genders. It tends to be architecturally and in terms of their sacred spaces, the men are allotted a significantly larger amount of space. Women are usually relegated to a certain spot within the building, perhaps in a room or something like this. Is this perhaps an assessment they've made that's incorrect, or
most likely it's an incorrect assessment. Part of it might be that, well, you know, when a lot of places are bought, they're bought and converted from a building that was originally made for another purpose. And so there's no elegant solution. There's a main door and a side door, and generally the women get the side door. Not always though, right? And so sometimes it's a problem of taking an existing structure that doesn't meet Muslim needs. Sometimes it's a masjid that's grown. They had a place they were renting, and it happened to be the case that more men would show up. So they thought that when they build their own masjid, they should give more room to the men. Sometimes it's a matter of different cultures coming together, and those cultures may value women's participation less than men's participation in the masjid. But regardless of what the cause may be, right, that's not a justification. What we need to do as a Muslim community is see that, yes, for Muslims, modesty and chastity for men and women in their own way is an operative value. We're not going to give it up for material success. We're not going to give it up for conformity to secular values. Right? For men and women to feel like they are valued and they have opportunities for intellectual and spiritual growth is an Islamic value. And the Quran is very clear in addressing both men and women in religious questions, and in acknowledging that women should have access to the Prophet or to the Imam in order to get their religious guidance. Right? And that's a principle that would apply through our own time as well. Right? So those are things that we have from within our value system. We need to try to create spaces within the masjid that fulfill the totality of those values that we have. In some cases, some of those values may have changed over time, in the sense that it's possible, hypothetically speaking, that it was possible for a Muslim woman to keep a strong identity in a traditional society without having to go frequently to the masjid. Today in America, given the fact that we don't always have as active extended family networks, we don't have other forms of social and personal participation in society. It might be the case that without participation in the masjid, that's not possible. The religious knowledge cannot be gained, the spiritual growth cannot be gained. And so we need to give more focus on women's participation within the masjid. And so if there's a short answer, I think it's that the way that masjids have been constructed or currently are operated is not necessarily an ideal. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to try to equalize everything. It doesn't mean that we're going to try to reconstruct masjids so that we'll be politically correct. But it means that we do need to try to re-engage with our Islamic values and see how we can best apply them in our society. And there will be differences of opinion. It need not be antagonistic. So it doesn't mean that there's one clear, obvious answer that all of us need to accept. And then if there is a woman who doesn't accept it, then she's just being stubborn. Or if there is a man who has a particular view, he's just being chauvinistic, or vice versa. Right? This is a process that is a continuing process. It's part of that dynamism that we talked about earlier. And we shouldn't assume that if somebody does not understand things as I do, then they're automatically being obstinate. That might be the case, but it might not.
Are there any brothers or sisters who have any questions or any comments to add to the discussion?
The questions don't need to directly follow the specific issues we've covered. Some of the issues we've covered are conceptual in general, and it would be great if you had a follow-up question that's down to earth and specific.
Yes.
So, I wasn't at the very beginning. You know, the rules, some of the rules that Islam has seem to basically be more than just, maybe it's better to say some of the cultures that are promoted as Islamic, basically traditions maybe, are not necessarily the minimums that are basically required based on the rules, but there is more than that. So the restrictions that are usually promoted by religious, basically scholars, are sometimes more than just those lines, red lines, that beyond them it will be a sin, you know. So for instance, if you're talking about woman and man in a meeting, you know, attending in a meeting, it's like commonly promoted that they should sit in different sides of the room. Though like the red line is not that woman and man have to be sitting in different sides of the room, but it's that they have to have a certain sort of limitation in their direct interactions, right? So my question is that extra caution, isn't that like looking as if you're being too sensitive or being a little over?
Sure.
Yeah, that is a question clear.
The question is clear. I think it's a relatively important question, and I can broaden it. I'll answer the question, which was basically boils down to sometimes we have precaution in religion about gender relations, or maybe about diet, or about something else that it might seem to be much more than what the red line in Sharia is. As a whole, Islam does say that your religion is the most important thing. It's been compared in one hadith to your brother, your family member. So we should be precautious about our religion. But precaution doesn't always mean, to be precautious, doesn't always mean that we move in one particular direction. Sometimes, to be precautious, we have to balance different types of obligations. To give one example, right? I need to be respectful of another person's needs, and I also have to be mindful of my own modesty and my own spiritual obligations. If I'm overly precautious in terms of my own modesty, I might be dismissive of, say, another person's legitimate need. And that's not being precautious. That might actually be sinful. How can we resolve that? It's important for us to know what are the red lines of Sharia. And when we know what the red lines are, then we have to figure what is the balance that we need to maintain in order to be able to best honor all of those red lines. The Quran mentions that there are hudud of Allah. The hududullah, the red lines of Allah, we need to be aware of. But we don't want to always live at the margins and at the red lines. When it comes to a meeting, which is the example that you gave, certainly it's important for us to maintain as much propriety and chastity in our meetings as possible. At the same time, we want to try to make sure that the interaction between men and women is not something that is being hindered. We don't want to create an obstacle. So depending on the type of meeting and the type of interaction that is needed to accomplish the purpose of the meeting, we want to maximize the modesty. In some cases, like in this setting right now, we have men sitting on one side and women sitting on the other side. And the purpose of this gathering can be accomplished equally or perhaps better in that way than if we had mixed seating. But there might be some settings when family seating or a mixed seating with a hijab may be the only way to accomplish the purpose of that gathering. So when we know what the red lines are, we can better make that determination. And the determination will be context specific. But the idea that precaution is something that we should be avoiding, that's something that Islam does not support. Be precautionary, just recognize that sometimes when you are going to exercise precaution, you might be bumping up against another religious value. If I'm too careful, and therefore I'm not acknowledging women or answering their questions or engaging in a healthy relationship, that's not being precautionary. That's bumping up against a red line in religion, which I'm not supposed to bump up against. I think actually we're probably going to have to...
Looks like we are out of time, I believe. So Sayyid Sulaiman, thank you so much for your time and the enlightening discussion. And thanks to all of those who participated and listened eagerly. That was a very fruitful discussion. I believe I'll just make a few announcements on behalf of the MCC. There's a lot of these discussions are being taped and they're available online on MCC's Facebook page. And of course, I would like to remind the brothers and sisters that these very fruitful and productive gatherings here in Shahr Ramadan, they are costly, and so if you could kindly consider donating very generously. And once again, thank you all for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.